It is Friday, June 19th, just hitting in right towards the middle of the summer, and you're listening to Reel in the Field Goals podcast. I'm your co host, Kenneth Arthur. My co host today is Danny Kelly, I believe. Danny, how are you?
I'm doing well, Kenny. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I think we got a corker of a show today, a corker of a guest. Um, you know, Let me just say that the salary cap is something that it's always, I guess, bugged me a little bit, not in the terms of the fact that, it's something that we have to think about, but it bugs me how it seems to override everything that people seem to think about the team that they root for. They think way too much about money when it's just, that's not their job. Let the people that know how the salary cap works, figure out the job. So to me, that's always been a little frustrating. But I'll say that, at one point, actually, it was Davis Sue said that he uses this site called overthecap.com. I had never heard of it before that day. And ever since then, it's like, I think before that, I came up with like, you would go to Roto World or Sport Trek, and none of that stuff really worked for me the way I wanted it to work. And overthecap.com has these amazing tools like the cap calculator. They got everything that you could ask for in a website that handles NFL contracts. And our guest today is Jason Fitzgerald. He founded the whole dang site. He writes for the site. He's also contributed to the sporting news. He still does that. I recently read him in a article on the Monday Morning Quarterback with Peter King, and he's got his own podcast, Over the Cap. So check that one out. Jason, how are you?
Pretty good. Thank you for the very nice introduction there.
Oh, absolutely. Game respect game. So when I see that the way that Peter King talks about you, he did drop your age. I don't know if that was something that you allowed Peter King to talk about how old you are, but he dropped your age right in the beginning. And then he went on to ask you three questions. One of these questions was which GM or which team handles the cap the best. And you narrowed it down to the 49ers and the Patriots. This was in March. You talked about the Patriots and how they have you singled them out as the best in the NFL in terms of being able to see the long-term picture, never contributing too much in guaranteed money, always protecting themselves. The other team, the 49ers, well, that who cares about the cap at this point with them? They've got much bigger things to worry about. But where would you put the Seattle Seahawks and John Schneider and Pete Carroll, because they work on this stuff together? Where exactly would you put the Seahawks in that list? Are they one of the upper echelon teams because in terms of salary cap management? Because, it's going to be something that people are going to talk a lot about for the next year, what with all these big names seemingly about to hit free agency.
I think with Seattle, there's really kind of two aspects to them. One thing I would say is they're probably, in terms of having flexibility, not over guaranteeing contracts, being able to move away from players. I would say they're probably in the top 10 in the NFL when it comes to that. When it comes to things like overall contract valuations, it's a little bit different. They're very different, I would say, than almost anyone else in the NFL. They kind of will go on the high end for certain players that they feel very strongly about. And we've seen that with a lot of market-setting contracts. Richard Sherman, Earl Thomas, even Marshawn Lynch from where he was. That wasn't a market setter, but I think for where he was at the time when he originally signed, I think that was a market setter. I guess his new one, maybe you would call it that as well. But, I think they go on the high end with the way that they value certain players. But, it's worked for them. They take a lot of risks. And I think as long as the good risks, have worked out, I think it balances out some of the bad ones that they've had, like the Percy Harvins and the Sidney Rice moves. So, I guess overall you would probably say somewhere middle of the pack. But I think in terms of just overall cap flexibility, I'd probably put them somewhere in the top 10.
Jason, Danny here. I just wanted to first off compliment you on your very, very, as Kenny said, your very, very helpful website. I use it almost every day when I'm doing analysis on the Seahawks and the NFL at large. I think the NFL salary cap is becoming a lot more popular and a lot more, fans are starting to pay attention to it a lot more these days. And so I really feel like you guys got in at the right time in terms of, really putting together such a solid product. What's kind of the background behind your creation of the site?
Just a regular football fan, and years ago, much like yourself, blogging about the Seahawks, I just kind of got the idea that I wanted to write a little bit about my favorite team, which was the Jets. But I took a very different approach. I just really wanted to get into the numbers aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just kind of taught myself about the salary cap, used as many resources as possible to, gather contract information from beat reporters, other people that I could meet along the way, certain agents. And then eventually it really grew from there. And within, I would say probably 2 or 3 years of doing that, I mean, it was pretty big within the Jets community for that. It caught the eye, I think, of certain teams just for the work that I was doing, the analysis that was there, even if the numbers weren't always 100% correct. And then at one point I just decided, I think this would be fun to kind of try and do for the entire league. And that was really just where it went from there. I never expected it to become as popular as it did. But, it's kind of taken on a little bit of a life of its own, to have out there, especially during free agency time. And, I'll try and be, usually help people out with questions that they have and everything else on it, whether it's on Twitter or email or anything else. But, there's really no specialized training to it or anything like that. It's just digging your head into the CBA, learning about it. Now there's so much more contract information. It's so much easier than when I first did it. Not just from my site. I mean, you just go on Twitter and, basically almost every beat reporter in the league is nowadays getting access to these contracts and reading out the numbers. And you just need to learn how to put them into context and what those numbers mean, which I can usually do pretty well. But that's really it. And, like I know you had mentioned Davis before, he basically does that kind of for you guys, I believe.
Right. Exactly.
He's like a capologist, loves it, and, really goes for it with his favorite team, the Seahawks. And that just makes it much easier to learn, I think, when it's a team that you're, really vested in. And, that's what I would always encourage people to do, in your spare time, if you really want to try and do this, pick a team and learn how to do it. And, just work through with it. It's not easy. It doesn't come overnight. It takes some time, and, it takes some time before anyone even notices that you're doing it. But, it's something that definitely anyone and everyone, I think, can learn nowadays.
I think as writers like myself and Danny, we don't give enough credit to the websites that basically make our jobs able. We can't do our jobs without sites like like I said, I don't even like having to deal with salary cap, and I'm on overthecap.com every single day. You just have to. You have to be on there. You have to know the situations. But, definitely so much credit goes out to guys like yourself and, the people that create profootballreference.com and Football Outsiders and Pro Football Focus that allow us to do our jobs every day. Just moving over to the Seahawks and some Seahawks narrowed focus. You mentioned a few of the guys and how they'll pay their premium players premium dollars. Earl Thomas, Richard Sherman, Cam Chancellor. Cam Chancellor's a pretty good deal on what he's got, but they've got some really expensive guys out there. But at the same time, Russell Wilson, arguably the most valuable player on the team. Some would say that if you have a good quarterback, he'll always be the most valuable. Those negotiations are still ongoing. A lot of rumors flying this way and that. What are your thoughts so far on everything that you've heard about the Russell Wilson negotiations?
I'm still a little surprised that nothing got done. I was in the camp that thought that the Seahawks, based on past history, would have just made him the highest priced quarterback in the NFL as soon as the regular season was over. I thought they would have done it last year before the playoff season began because they had the ability by the CBA to do it basically in January, and I figured it was just a formality. So I'm a little surprised that it's not done. I think what's going on now is I think there's a lot of things with this that are playing out in the media, not specifically in terms of Wilson being unhappy. I think he's handled this pretty much as perfect as you could want someone to handle something. You don't hear him about holding out or being upset or angry about his contract or anything like that. But I do think you see a lot of reporting nowadays where you start talking about certain contract metrics that didn't necessarily exist even a couple months ago, or at least exist in terms of being important. And I think those kind of things have hampered the negotiations that they've had with him, specifically really looking at how much money he's going to make between now and 2017. For some reason, this has kind of become a very, a popular talking point in light of the Cam Newton contract and the Ryan Tannehill contract. And really what it is, it's agents putting numbers out there to try and make something sound historic, make it sound bigger than it really is. But contracts really were never valued that way. They were looked at in what would be considered 3 years of new money, and 3 years now of just factoring in old contract money when these players are all making $15 million a year. It makes it near impossible for Seattle to come up and meet that metric on Russell Wilson, because it would require them to pay him like $68 million over the next 3 years. And that's just not a feasible number. You know, the other players in terms of new money are around $54 million, and their new money total over 3 years is about $68 million. So I kind of feel like that is probably the biggest divide that's there right now. Wilson does have a different agent. You know, he has a baseball agent, so that might add a different layer of complexity to the negotiations. But I will admit, I'm a little surprised that they didn't get a deal done.
In terms of the new money APY, the average per year, where do you think, like, what would be your prediction of where he's going to end up?
Well, I've been pretty steadfast on it. I think he should be the highest paid player in the NFL. I know people say, well, he's not as good as Aaron Rodgers. That doesn't matter. You know, basically in league history, the best quarterback is not always the highest paid player. He's only the highest paid player for maybe a snapshot in time.
Right.
You know, Peyton Manning was the highest paid player for a little bit of time. Drew Brees was the highest paid player for a little bit of time. You know, the highest paid players have been Ben Roethlisberger, Eli Manning, Joe Flacco. You know, these are all very good quarterbacks in their own right, but I don't think anyone would have ever said that these players were the best at their positions when they signed. So, you know, it's important postseason wins. That's really become an important thing for the quarterbacks. You know, importance to a team, because going back in the draft and trying to get a quarterback is a complete unknown, and there's clearly no low-level veterans that you can just plug and play anymore. Those days are long gone. So I can't really see any reason why he wouldn't be at least $22.5 million a year. I would think somewhere between $22.5 and $23.5 is a fair number for him.
What would you attribute to being the most important thing in Wilson's camp to get out of this deal? You know, I know that Davis talks about the first 3 years, how much cash and how much money comes in those first 3 years. And a lot of teams, they give these contracts, and, you know, people see the overall scope and they look at APY and they look at total value and they look at guaranteed money. But at the end of the day, you know, Colin Kaepernick's $100 million whatever deal doesn't look that good when in terms of those kinds of numbers. And other people, you know, the money is backloaded if you're Ryan Tannehill. So if you're Russell Wilson, you know, he just took out an insurance policy assuming that he's not going to get a deal, and he's probably going to play this one on his, you know, relatively small contract, you know, relative to other NFL players. I would love to make $1 million this year, but what is Russell Wilson looking to get?
You know, I would think, and again, you know, this is speaking more from a football perspective, so maybe from a baseball agent's perspective, it's something completely different. He might be looking much more at, you know, full guarantees or something like that. But I would think what you would want to do is you would want to basically be the leader in the cash flows on the contract pretty much throughout the life of the contract. You know, if Aaron Rodgers makes $40 million in new money in the first year, I think that is somewhere in the ballpark of where he wants to be. I think he wants to have that 3-year total be higher than the other players at the position. I don't think he wants to be tied with Roethlisberger and especially Cam Newton, who, you know, he might have better draft status, but statistically there's really no difference between the two. And Russell Wilson is clearly the much more successful quarterback of the two. I would think that's really what it's about, is getting as much money as you can in those first 3 years to be the market setter, and at the same time having that market setting contract on the top end. I think that's what you want. I don't think you want to take those Tannehill or Kaepernick deals where you need to prove it for a couple of years before you really get that catch-up money to really make that contract go from being, in their case, what's, you know, more like a $16 million a year deal into the $19 million range. So I think what they're looking for is, you know, just those high numbers all throughout the contract life.
Two-part question. First off, is there much precedent in terms of quarterbacks playing out the final year of their contract before they get, you know, to the, like, free agency? For instance, Joe Flacco, you know, I think he played out his entire the whole year, the whole final year of his contract before he signed a new contract. What's the precedent on that? And secondly, do you think if you had to make a prediction right now, do you think it's going to get done before this season?
Well, to answer the first part of your question, I mean, that there are players that get there. Drew Brees played out his contract. Jay Cutler played out his contract.
Okay.
So there are players that make it that far. Peyton Manning, when he was a member of the Colts, he played out his contract. So it's not as uncommon as people make it out to be.
Interesting.
I think the uncommon part is people sometimes forget that the franchise tag is part of the equation. None of these players really made it to free agency,
right?
But they did make it to the end of their contracts. They were tagged or they were extended, before free agency began. So there are players who play out their contracts. So I don't think that's really out of the ordinary. And what was the second part of your question again?
I just wanted to know if you like gun to your head, had to make a guess, is it going to get done before this year, or do you think he's going to try and play hardball and play out this season on his rookie deal?
Just based on some of the chatter that you hear, and you never really take that for too much. I would guess at this point he's probably going to play it out, but I don't really have a strong feeling on that because again, everything you hear now is just posturing and rumors by two sides, and sometimes you'd be surprised the way deals kind of come out of left field pretty quickly. After a report will come out.
Let me pull that gun away from your head real quick. I don't think it was really loaded anyway, but let's move on real quick unless Danny has something else. Well, you know what? There was one other thing that I alluded to earlier, which was the insurance policy. Is this something that's actually quite common for players? I know that it's becoming more common, or at least more talked about in college with EFO at Oregon, taking out an insurance policy. Is this something becoming more common for players, these insurance policies, just in case anything goes bad while they're waiting to get their security?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's been a part of the college game, at least for a little bit of time, especially in the old CBA years. I mean, draft picks are worth so much money at that point in time. I think it was almost a necessity for people to do that. I haven't heard about it as much in the pros, but at the same time, those are not really the things that often come to light. I think this one came to light just because, it leaked out there just to prove a point that he's very willing to play out the season, and he's taken out an insurance policy to prove, to cover himself, just to show that he's willing to play it out. It could play a part in negotiations as well. If they did not want to do a high level of injury guarantees, I could see them saying, why don't you take out a policy on yourself and we'll give you more money since you're showing an inclination to do it anyway, rather than us giving you an injury guarantee and then us having to pay the premium on the policy. The little things like that can sometimes probably become a negotiating point as well once you start going down that road. But I do think it's something that's probably becoming a bit more common.
And everyone's kind of focused on Russell Wilson in this offseason, and for obvious reasons. But one guy that's kind of flown under the radar in terms of his upcoming contract extension is Seahawks middle linebacker Bobby Wagner. Just came out recently that the team's trying to get something done with him. First off, what's the climate? What's the contract landscape like for inside linebackers? What can we kind of expect?
Well, I think that's one of those deals where they will probably make him the highest paid in the NFL at the position. And I have a feeling that this will be one of those deals that does get done in August. It'll be one of those, 2 weeks into training camp or something, there'll be an announcement that they came to an agreement. Right now, the market's probably around $9 million a year.
Okay.
That's where Bowman is from the 49ers. Brian Cushing from the Texans. Timmons is above that, but that's a contract from a couple of years ago. Patrick Willis was probably the market leader for a while. I think he hit $10 million. He recently retired. So I think the price that he's probably going to be looking for is $10 million. And I think they would probably do that. I think that would match what they gave per year. I believe they're all Thomas. And so that would kind of say, okay, that's the guy in the middle in the secondary. You're the guy in the middle in the second level. And so you should get kind of that same figure. So I kind of feel like that's where that's headed. What
kind of guaranteed money are you looking at in terms of, obviously $10 million a year around that? What's the sort of benchmark for the guaranteed money?
The guarantees aren't going to be that big. I would think the guarantees in this case would probably be, 11 million, 12 million in terms of full guarantees.
Okay.
They'll throw in some vesting guarantees or some other stuff. But in terms of truly guaranteed money, it'll probably be in the ballpark of $12 million. Yeah, just a little bit above whatever the annual value is for the year. That seems to be what most teams have done with the inside linebackers. And I think that's one of those concessions that you have to make. If you want to have that designation as being the highest paid at any position but quarterback's totally different ballgame. But if you want to have that designation, sometimes you have to give in a little bit. I think on some of the other things with it. You know, the outliers, they're players, you know, David Harris, Sean Lee, they have very high guarantees. They have lower valued contracts, but David Harris has like 70% of his contract, I think, guaranteed or something like that. That's not really normal either. So I would say probably around 11, 12 million. I think that just fits in with everything.
Jason, just when you're talking about positions there, and, you know, I'm sure as a guy that manages caps every day in your daily life, at least, like, you know, playing with the cap calculator, doing those kinds of things, imagining in your head the Jets signing a certain player and seeing how it fits in. And we're talking about a middle linebacker, and even if Bobby Wagner is one of the top 3 middle linebackers in the NFL, as in your personal opinion, is there a position where is it possible that that's a position that you would tell yourself, I'm never going to give a middle linebacker $10 million a year? Or, you know, are there other positions where you say, I can't believe that teams spend this much on, you know, X position when, you know, there are so much more important, you know, things to consider at other positions while you're trying to factor in how you're going to make all this money fit, like, you know, like you're playing Tetris and trying to figure out how everything fits in. And maybe you don't sign Bobby Wagner to that deal because you've got, you know, other guys coming up for contracts. What are your thoughts on even giving a linebacker that kind of money?
Yeah, you know, that's a great point that you're making, because that is the kind of question that comes up all the time. You know, do you want to pay elite money to what really has not been an elite pay position, or maybe even an elite importance position? I think in this case, I think he's pretty important to the defense. I think he can do a lot of things for them. I think it's probably justified a little bit more in this case. I think it's less justified for the 49ers, for instance, when they have the 2 linebackers making $9 and $10 million a year. I think that's a little bit less justified to do. You know, my team, the Jets, when they had Bart Scott and David Harris on expensive contracts, that's kind of a waste of resources at that point. I think if it's one player, I think it's okay to do as long as he contributes on 3 downs, as long as he can impact the game pretty much on every play. I think it's okay to do. But yeah, it's something that you have to judge with each situation, the way the defenses are set up, and really the play time that those players have. You know, I think that's really the way that you have to come up with it. But I think they'd be okay with probably giving him that money.
And that's a great kind of point in terms of, you know, right, just this week that the Bruce Irvin returned to Seahawks minicamp. He's kind of pissed off about, you know, the Seahawks not picking up his 5th-year option. Now he's a little bit, you know, worried about his contract, and the talk has been that the Seahawks may not be able to re-sign him next year. He's kind of an interesting case in terms of, you know, he plays in a unique role for the Seahawks, or somewhat unique anyway. And then it seems obvious the Seahawks value Bobby Wagner over Bruce Irvin. Normally speaking, most teams would value an outside linebacker over, or a defensive end over a middle linebacker. It's more of a premium position. What are your thoughts on Bruce Irvin's value, and kind of what Seahawks fans could expect maybe a range would be for his second contract?
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
He's one of those players, I think, that's very hard to judge. You know, you're talking about someone that has that high, kind of that draft cachet that a lot of players will carry into a second contract, you know, like Brandon Graham or whatever did last year with the Eagles.
Right.
But I don't think you'd look at a player like Irvin and say, you know, he's really fulfilled any kind of potential yet. You know, I would guess if he goes on the open market, you know, he would probably be looking at those deals along the lines of, you know, with Derek Morgan. You know, those are the same kind of players, I think, there. I believe most of those guys are right around $6.5, $7 million a year.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit under that. I think that's probably what his expectation is. I think the Seahawks probably look at him much more as a, you know, kind of a rotational guy, more of a guy that they're not going to give like a those kind of opportunities to really stand out in that kind of role. So my guess is they look at him more as like a $4.5 million to $5.5 million player. I don't know if that's a divide that, you know, they'll be able to kind of bridge. I kind of think that he'll probably end up somewhere else next season.
Yeah, and his his fifth-year option was somewhere around 7.5. So that kind of tells you exactly how they value him. If they don't value him at that number, I mean, obviously, if they had valued him there, they would have picked it up. But he's one of those. The dynamic between Wagner and Irvin is an interesting one because, like I said, typically it's flip-flopped in terms of teams put the premium on the outside guys more than the inside. So.
You know, just diverting, using that as a quick little tangent here when we were talking about, you know, fifth-year options for these players, you know, it's becoming so important after we got past the 2011 draft and starting with that 2011 draft and Cam Newton's deal after the CBA and these guys getting these very, you know, there is no more question how much money these guys get paid. The rookies, they sign the deals. Jason, in terms of the cap situation and the contract situation after that 2011 CBA agreement, how much more is this benefiting the teams, or was it a good situation for the players because, you know, of the guaranteed money for first-round picks?
Well, that's another one of those tricky subjects. You know, a lot of people are very anti the rookie wage scale that came in the CBA. I think actually for players that were picked after, definitely outside the top 10, maybe players that were even picked outside of the top 8, I think they actually have a better deal now than they had before. As long as you're a decent player, you know, you got to prove that you're worth that 50-year option. That 50-year option gives you a lot more leverage than you had in the old CBA. And depending on which positions you play, you've probably earned more over that contract term than you did in the prior CBA. For those top 8 picks, yeah, that was a killer for them.
You know, since you're a Jets fan, I got to ask.
It was on Newton a couple weeks ago, I guess, when he signed his extension. I mean, he's probably lost about $40 million in his career between being picked in 2011 versus being picked in 2010 as the top pick.
Wow.
So, I mean, it's a massive loss that some of those top players got.
You know, as a Jets fan, I got to ask, you know, I remember Darrelle Revis gave the Jets a hell of a time in those first couple of years and what he expected to be paid right from the beginning. You know, and his negotiation tactics are tough as hell. So how would Darrelle Revis, if he was being drafted today, do you think that he would have any it sort of neutralizes those players and says, no, there is no negotiations in those first 3 years. Do you think that Darrelle Revis would be very happy to come into the league now as a rookie?
Well, not really, but he would have ended up following the same kind of contract pattern he did with the Jets. When he was with New York the first go-around, he played out the first 3 years of his rookie deal because those were the years that had the incentivized money in there. Basically, he had, I think, 2 roster bonuses that totaled, I don't know, probably around $7.5 million in the years 2 and year 3. So he played those years out, and as soon as that year ended, he went into his holdout. And it was a perfect storm for him because he came off that 2009 season, which was just a absolutely ridiculous year. And he held out. You know, he had no intention of coming back. He was going to hold out for the season because his salary that year was basically about $1 million, maybe less than that. So he would have done the same thing now. He would have played those first 3 years because he would have had no choice. And he would have just simply said, I'm not playing, I'm not showing up. You pay me $16 million or I'm not coming back. And he would have held firm on that. So he would have made less money overall, but I think the situation would have played out pretty much identical to the way it did with the Jets.
Gotta respect it. I gotta respect it from someone watching a player because, you know, it's not like teams honor contracts. So it's like for a guy to go out there and, you know, get paid almost as much as a franchise quarterback over the life of his career as a cornerback, you know, it's something to behold.
Yeah, they've done a pretty good job with him. You know, they've really pushed the envelope with a lot of the things there that they've done. Those are not tactics that most players, most agents will do. His agency has pushed that with a couple other guys. Vincent Jackson was one of them. In his case, he held out for pretty long time in San Diego, and San Diego wouldn't budge. Eventually, he had to come back because of fear that he might lose his free agent status at some point.
Mm-hmm.
So he did eventually give in and come back, and then he got the big deal from Tampa Bay later on. You know, but there's not too many players that'll do that. But Revis has he's basically set a new mold for, I think, the way players will, kind of take over these negotiations. And, he's done it with the Jets twice now. He's done it with the Buccaneers and even somewhat with the Patriots. So, more power to him. They've just done a tremendous job with him. It's something that I don't know if we'll ever see again. But, he's definitely a unique player when it comes to the contracts and negotiations and everything else.
Jason, in terms of, they talk about the premium positions in the NFL. And so you're talking about left tackle, cornerback, obviously quarterback, and then there are a few others, defensive end, outside linebacker. It seems like in the past couple of years, the left tackle position might not necessarily have been like less valued, but it's kind of talked about a little bit less. It seems like that might just be my bias, but the Seahawks have their left tackle, Russell Okung, coming up after this year. I guess, could you just give Seahawk fans a little primer on what the left tackle position kind of climate is for the next couple of years?
Yeah, I think you're pretty much right about it. That it's talked about a lot less. It's been stagnant really for the last, 4 years. I would say it's really been a stagnant market. I know Smith last year signed a big deal with Dallas, but that was a deal that's going to keep him under contract in Dallas until he's like 90 years old. So it's not really even a legitimate value. It's one of those things that's, a super high number, but he's not going to earn most of that money. And even if he does, it's going to be well under market by the time he gets there.
Right.
It's really just been dead for the position. I think there's so much more versatility along the defensive lines with your left and right defensive ends or your left and right outside linebackers now really being much more interchangeable than they used to be. You really need to have good bookends on both sides to deal with the way that teams are moving around their pass rushers. So I think because of that, the left tackle has kind of, hit a wall. It's still more important than the right tackle position, and that plays out in the contract numbers. But it's definitely not, playing up with the way that the quarterback position has grown in salary or receivers. It hasn't grown like that. For your left tackle, again, that's a tough one because, he's a player where, he's making right now, I'm trying to think of his rookie deal. His rookie deal is probably around $8 million a year, give or take a little bit. And I don't know if he's necessarily worth that in free agency. Mm-hmm. I guess he would be. He's got that draft status there, but I look at him more like a DeBrickashaw Ferguson on the Jets or, maybe a Trent Williams, who's, basically going to be vying for a contract with him, out in Washington, where, you draft those guys high and you're expecting Walter Jones. That's what you're expecting. Yeah. And really hoping for. You don't get that. You get a very good, competent player, but you're not getting, that once in a generation, that kind of, that rock that's going to be there for a decade. Right. So I think you got to question what the value is going to be on that. Everyone I think points to that Ferguson deal, which at this point now is just, it's so old. I don't think it matters anymore. But he was really the last of the guys that really got a contract based on draft status and the fact that he was pretty good, but not necessarily great, but he had the potential to be great. Mm-hmm. That got that $10 million a year deal for that. You look at Brandon Albert, I think he got about $9.5 million. I think that's probably the high end of your market, but I would guess he'd be more along the lines of a Eugene Monroe, somewhere along there, $7.5 million, maybe something like that. Maybe if he gets into free agency, he can find something more, or maybe if he has just a monstrous season. I just don't know if he stands out enough to really challenge those players that are in that 9 million plus category. And I definitely don't think he's going to get into the double digit numbers. I can't imagine that happening.
I wrote about the 2016 free agency earlier this month for sportsonearth.com. And I recall it's a very talented one. If, a lot of those players hit free agency, many of them won't. But I do recall that, Trent Williams, Andrew Whitworth, these are some considered top 5 tackles. When you're in a market that has a position, especially a position of need that's, say, very good at the top or very flooded with talent, is that good for a player like Russell Okung? Or is that something that actually sort of pushes him down because he's not the best on the market?
It goes year from year. You'll see different things happen. The year a bunch of those wide receivers got a lot of money, the Mike Wallace year, it helped by even being the worst in that group. it really pulled the salaries up for everybody. But then you'll have other years where, the opposite happens. You'll have a lot of good players, even this year a little bit at the, defensive end outside linebacker market. While those players are a little bit more unproven, I think a lot of people assume that all those guys are going to be making $9 million a year, $10 million a year, and then Jerry Hughes signs for under $10 million, and next thing you know, everything just kind of plummets. So I think it's kind of hard to project one way or the other. I don't think there's a rhyme or reason to it. It just seems to happen that way sometimes. I've never really been able to get the logic behind it. Just some years it pulls everyone up, and in other years everybody ends up down because there's just a number of people, and they don't feel like there's a lot of separation in talent, and they figure they'll be happy with anybody, so they'll just get the person that they can get cheapest.
Have you noticed any truth to the contract year sort of mythology that, as you said, what if he has a monster season? And a lot of people, maybe it's more of a baseball thing, but a lot of people always say, wow, he had such a great season. We had been waiting for that for 3 or 4 years. And then all of a sudden he has this monster season and he costs a lot of money. Is there any truth to that, or it's just sort of, narrative?
I think there is. Yeah, I definitely think there is, but I think it depends on the players. I think it's a player. If you look at a player and you kind of say to yourself, what's holding this guy back is you don't think he's giving the effort on, every down that he's out there. Those are the kind of players I think that have that breakout year come free agency, and then they probably pull back the year after that once they get paid. I don't think it happens with, the players who are out there giving it their all the time. I think those guys just, play that way. Maybe they'll train a little harder in the off season, come in better shape. But I look more at those question mark kind of players and say those are the guys that really come out there and, I don't know, really break the expectations, or at least the norms that we're seeing for them, and they those lofty expectations for one season. And, then they hope that you get a team to bite on them in free agency and overpay them. And, then usually, I think usually in those situations, the teams end up pretty disappointed.
You talked about how left tackle and right tackle are kind of becoming a little bit more equal in value, or they're going in that direction. I think that the same can be said about the guard position. I think in the past couple of years, there's been higher drafted guards than what we'd seen normally. And J.R. Sweezy, Seahawks right guard, he's coming up on his contract as well. And the Seahawks have always kind of sung his praise and really like his attitude and everything like that. What's the market like for the guard position in terms of guys getting onto their second contract?
I think for him, I think based on, just looking at kind of his resume and where he stands, the position he plays, I would say he's probably in that range of $5 million a year.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're looking at, John Asamoah from the Falcons. He makes 4 or 5. That's probably the floor, I would think, for him. Below that is a guy like Jeff Schwartz, who, didn't really have a big track record as a starter. He was a guy that was kind of a spot starter, and then injuries got him in with Kansas City for the 1 year, and then, he parlayed that into a nice little contract with the Giants. The Vikings guard makes, I think, just under $5 million. TJ Lang in Green Bay, he makes a little over $5 million. I think that's kind of the range for them. Guys that aren't necessarily super high draft picks, not maybe standout players, but guys who are, decent enough. They can go in there and they're going to be professionals, and they're going to give you, pretty good games here and there. So I think that's probably where it is for him. 4 years, $5 million a year, so somewhere in that vicinity.
Okay.
Is probably where he's going to end up.
Speaking of guards and free agency and comparing them to J.R. Sweezy and Seahawks and your team, the Jets, you guys signed James Carpenter. Was that an overpay, or is that about right for a guy like Carpenter?
I didn't really understand that one. I think that was one where the price gets boosted because of where the guy was once drafted. And,
right.
It happens with teams. You'll have a front office that graded these players, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, however many years ago the draft was. And, sometimes they have a very high opinion of those players. And even if they necessarily haven't performed that well, most of the time they're going to say he needs a different situation. He needs different guys around him. He needs a different coach. He needs different teaching methods. And they always believe that player has an opportunity to really exceed the level that he's been at. So I kind of feel like that was where that contract came from. I didn't really get that at all because I didn't think that he was really a very good player in Seattle. I thought he was, someone that was just kind of there. And if he got forced into action, he got forced into action, and you kept your fingers crossed that he wasn't going to mess up.
Right.
Obviously, the Jets have a lot of problems on their offensive line that they need to fix there, and they need to get some youth in there. So I kind of get that. But, yeah, I would say he's overpaid at, $4.7, $4.8 million a year. Even if it's not a contract that they're really locked into for more than a season and a half or so, I think they probably could have gotten a better deal than they did with him.
And, along those lines, the Seahawks lost Carpenter in free agency. I think, your comments probably would echo a lot of people in Seattle's and their thought process on the kind of thing. And it seemed a little bit like, the Seahawks were going to say, if someone wants to pay him more than or overpay him, then let them. And they're not going to fight for him. And that's kind of, I think, what happened. They had a number in mind, and I think the Jets obviously beat that. But now they have a vacancy at left guard. Right now they're talking about a couple different guys at the position, but Evan Mathis was recently released in Philly, and a lot of people in Seattle are talking about how he could potentially fit if he was coming here at the right price. What would you think is his value? Because obviously he's more of like a third, fourth contract kind of guy. He's 34 years old. It's probably going to be more like a 1-year deal, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, I mean, they might be able to fudge the numbers a little bit by throwing some extra years on there to kind of boost an annual value to make it sound better than it is. He was set to earn $5.5 million from the Eagles. I kind of thought that was high.
Okay.
I understand, he's a good player. He's been Pro Bowl many, many times. I just feel like with the age and everything else that's probably a high number for a player. That's going to be coming out of a system. You're going to try and integrate him into, your system. I think the market's going to be a little bit softer for him than people think. I definitely don't think he'd get more than $5 million. I would kind of lean more towards being like a $3 million a year player with incentives in the deal that can, maybe boost it higher. And, maybe some fake second, third year numbers in there just to push him up a little more. But, usually the market for players at that age, the interior line, it's usually not that big. So, I don't expect there to be that kind of interest in him. And I think the fact that he's really been sitting out there for a little while now, if guys were going to come in with big money offers, he would have been signed already by the Denver Broncos or someone like that. So I think everyone is proceeding slowly with this, and that probably means he's not going to get, a ridiculous amount of money.
You talk about things like playing in a system. It's interesting, too, when you talk about a guy like Evan Mathis, his best couple of years overall have come in the 2 years that he's played for Chip Kelly, at least in terms of certain numbers. It seems like he is peaking right now playing for Kelly, and maybe people would be somewhat wary of signing a guy like that, just in the same way that, Byron Maxwell went to the Eagles, signed for $63 million. And a lot of people would say, here's a guy that has only, he's only started 17 regular season games. He started them all for Pete Carroll, arguably the greatest secondary coach of all time. And some people thinking, in the same way that Brandon Browner, couldn't last too long, for the Patriots, it was certain sort of deals. But do you think that that's a common mistake that you see GMs make, is that they overpay for guys that are coming out of another system when the NFL is so dependent on guys playing within a system?
Yeah, I think that also happens a lot. I think when you look at these players, you have to project as best you can how they're going to fit in your defense, how they're going to fit in the way you play. And if you're playing a completely different style of game, I think believing that player is going to translate is another one of those things that usually doesn't work out for you. The Maxwell contract was absurd. I didn't really see that one coming at all at that number. But I think that it's a hard thing to do to project that out because the teams, they are so varied. But I think that's definitely something that has to be taken into account. If you're talking about an offensive lineman, what kind of blocking scheme are you using? Because if you expect a player, especially in their 30s, to play a completely different style of game and fit in, it's not going to work. You want to look at that film and you want to see how much help is he really getting from the center and the left tackle. or center and the right tackle, because you have to realize, are those strengths that we have on our team to really help him out in the same way. So I think that has to play a big role in it. And I think a lot of times there are some teams that, especially in free agency, general manager, capologist, whomever their director of football admin, guys get caught up in the hype just as easily as any fan does. Everyone in there just gets caught up in it. And I think it's very easy to overlook it, just be like, I need this guy. I want this guy. I see that talent there. We'll find a way to get him to fit in. And, that sometimes those guys are really hard, really to get to mesh. And then next thing you know, you have, keeping it on the Eagles track there, you have Nandi Asamoah going to the Eagles that just can't play in that defense whatsoever. And, it's basically out of the league within 2-3 years after making a fortune with that team.
You talked about the Byron Maxwell deal kind of surprising you, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about, well, first off, the cornerback market this year was a little bit interesting in the fact that it felt to me like everyone was a little bit overvalued. And one, did you agree with that? And two, did the signing of Kerry Williams for what he's making around $6 million a year, was that surprising to you?
Yeah, the cornerback market, I think, had definitely a bounce back this year. It had kind of been down a little bit. And then last year you saw the first signs of pulling up with the Sherman, Peterson, and Hayden deals. And, I thought this year, some of those second-tier players, I think Maxwell is clearly a second-tier player. Him coming in at, $10.5 million was pretty crazy. That's really the one. Antonio Cromartie coming in where he came in after, being a $3 million player, those were kind of high figures, especially in light of Chris Harris, signing in the offseason with Denver, for lesser money. That's one of those guys who's got to be kicking himself, for doing that. That's probably, his reaction was he couldn't have been too happy, watching the contracts that came out. Williams, he was probably an overpay. He was not very good at all, but I think that's a situation where you're looking at a couple things there if you're Seattle. One, he was clearly unhappy with the Eagles head coach. So I think that's a situation where you look at the player and you say, okay, he was clashing with the coach. He didn't feel like as a veteran he was getting respect. He didn't feel like because the team was successful that the coach, kind of backed off. He didn't back off on the practices and all that. Now we're going to bring him in with Pete Carroll. And Pete Carroll is going to be much more friendly with them. He's going to, push them, but he's going to push them in the right way that, is going to get the respect out of the veteran player. And this guy's really going to want to contribute. And then you look behind and you see those great safeties that are here. And you say, you know what? We've got the support system in Seattle that can really help this guy out. And if they value him as the best player on the market in that kind of lower cost range, even though it's an overpay, I think you can justify it because you're going to say, well, he was the best available and we wanted to make sure we got him because we're very confident that he can work out in our system here. So I think you can justify it somewhat, but I think it's definitely a little bit of a reach saying that he's going to fit in with our organization better than he did with Chip Kelly taking over in Philadelphia.
Yeah, I don't have the quotes in front of me, but I do think that John Schneider said something along those lines where, it wasn't necessarily saying we overpaid for him, but he was just talking about how the market for the corners dictated sort of what they needed to spend to get a guy that they felt could come in and replace, a starter. So I think that's really well said. I'm pretty sure that's exactly kind of what the sort of thought process that went into it in terms of what Schneider said. So, and one more question, just kind of in general about the Seahawks. How would you rate their overall cap health and kind of what they look like going forward from now?
Oh, they're fine. They should be okay, even without Wilson under contract. I think I have them estimated next year around. They'll be a little under $40 million in cap room once the roster is maxed out. And obviously, Wilson will lead away at that. And,
right.
Wagner will lead away at that. Guys will lead away at that. But I think what Seattle did really last season, I think that made sure that their cap was going to be long-term much healthier, by letting a guy like Golden Tate go away. Making those decisions to cut some of those veterans along the defensive line or not bring them back. those were kind of the decisions I think that they had to make. They're not the decisions that are the most fun, for teams and for fans. But I think a lot of those decisions, I think they kind of went unnoticed because a lot of the guys, while they were making decent amount of money, especially because they were towards the back end of their contracts, I think people didn't realize how many guys really weren't brought back.
Right.
In terms of cap structure and how much flexibility they gained by that. So I think for them, that was kind of their year where you would say, all right, we'll take a little bit of a hit by having to work some new guys into the rotation, newer guys into the team, younger guys in, and they made it back to the Super Bowl. So no one really noticed it. Didn't become an issue. And I think now that's left them in a position where they're going to be okay, really for the next couple of years, unless they do something crazy. If they do something wild out there, like a Percy Harvin trade part two, they're going to have to go back in the draft and make sure that they go back to really, hitting a lot with the Thomases and the Shermans and the Wilsons, to where you have that constant influx of young talent worth, $12, $13, $14 million a year, playing for $4 million a season, or less.
This year, the Saints, hit a crazy cap moment where, they started having to unload some of their better players, to the Seahawks' benefit, especially with Jimmy Graham. But do you see any teams right now that are sort of riding a money train to gorge, about to go off a cliff? New Orleans, obviously, they're working their way through it. Jimmy Graham was, basically moved as, he was part of that. I think was a preemptive strike because they saw where their mess was headed, and it was going to be, even worse, I think, if they kept him on the team, and this was the most value that they could get there. Kansas City's not in a great position. They'll be in a little bit better position, I guess, next year. But they're really digging out of some issues. The Lions are consistently a team that has some issues with the cap. The Jets have done so much spending this year that, they're going to be in a position next year where they're going to have to make some decisions. Now, they have a lot of flexibility in their contract structure, but they're going to have some issues after the season. Same with probably the Buffalo Bills, who went crazy and really didn't give themselves flexibility in free agency. So, those are probably the teams that stand out the most moving forward. Did John Idzik help at all?
Some issues to navigate next year.
When you guys had John Idzik as the GM from the Seahawks, did he help at all? Are you guys in a better position? Even though he was fired, some of the things that he was known as a cap guru. So did he help put you guys in a better position to sign Darrelle Revis, or was it all not good?
Well, he did, but only because they didn't spend anything. I mean, he went through 2 years of really just doing nothing. I equated it to the New York Knicks. If anyone's familiar with their strategy a couple of years ago, it was do nothing, sign no one, give everyone away for the purpose of having money to get LeBron James in free agency. LeBron James didn't come there, and they were left with a roster of nobody and a ton of money. And the Jets kind of did the same thing, except I don't think he had a target in mind. They just created this giant surplus of money that he never got a chance to spend. Who knows what he would have done with it? But they didn't take any risks. I was very surprised by a lot of what they did, because I thought he would bring a little bit of the Seattle model in terms of, making a lot of moves, making a lot of transactions, trying to find something that works. And he didn't really do that. He just focused all his eggs in one basket, which was the draft. He just wanted to amass draft picks for 1 year. And I think he thought that he was going to find Richard Sherman, and he was going to find, all these guys late in the draft, and all the players stunk. And, he probably left them with one of the worst rosters in all of football. Some of those moves he had to make, but I don't think that there was anything that he did that really anybody else would not have done. So I don't know if you'd really credit him for it, but he did leave them with a lot of cap space. But I think if anyone was given the directive to just do nothing in free agency, do nothing with any guys on the team except cut, I think just about anybody would have been able to do that.
I have one final question for you before we wrap this up, and Kenny might have another one for you too. But the Seahawks right now, I was looking at Over the Cap, just playing around with some of your guys' cool features, and you have a thing on cap to cash ratio. And I just kind of wanted to, if you could just very quickly explain kind of what that means and why it's important for people that are playing around with that segment of your website. Like, what does cap to cash ratio mean?
Well, basically it's showing you how much cap dollars you have versus how much cash you have in a season. So teams that go overboard with the signing bonus money and everything else have these very low cap values, but have incredibly high cash budgets. Mm-hmm. And eventually that flips around, and that becomes a problem because at some point in time, when you start cutting these players, you end up with maybe not the Oakland Raiders season with, $50 million in dead money, but you'll end up like, the Indianapolis Colts the year that they got rid of Peyton Manning, $30 million in dead money.
Right.
The Jets in Idzik's first year, 20-something million in dead money. So I think nowadays what you see is the more progressive teams are really trying to balance it out, not in the sense of the way the Tampa Bay Buccaneers do business, which is no signing bonuses, all cash, everything else. But I think they try and make it so those numbers kind of come into play, because when you have one of those years where your cash budget is so high and your cap budget is so low, usually it really negatively impacts you in the future.
So you don't want to allocate cap hits to years where or cash to years where you're not going to be actually paying those people, I guess.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. So that makes sense. And that I just thought that was an interesting thing to play around with. I know I've heard Andrew Brandt talk about that a lot in terms of cash flow. And so that's one of those things that I think that fans don't really understand. And I'm one of them. I don't really understand, the importance of it.
Andrew's one of the first people I think that really pushed for that when he was in Green Bay. Green Bay has one of those kind of unique models that they follow where they do try and at times keep those as close together as possible. And they've had some pretty high payrolls in recent years, but they try and not go too overboard with the stuff, and they stay out of free agency to keep those ratios much closer together. They don't want to go down that path of, projecting a guy to fit in the system. They would much rather overpay a guy that they know fits in the system than bring in someone else that might be a little bit cheaper that they're going to find out doesn't fit in the system at all. So, there's a couple teams I think that really follow that, but he was definitely one of the first, I think, to really make it a point when he was running the Packers.
Interesting.
Awesome. I said at the top of the show that we had a corker of a guest and a corker of a show, and I think it was a corker for sure. So a lot of great stuff from Jason Fitzgerald at overthecap.com. He's the founder of overthecap.com. He also contributes to the Sporting News. Download his podcast, Over the Cap, and make sure to download our podcast. It's called Real in the Field Goals with me and Danny Kelly. And a great guest every week, just like Jason. Follow him on Twitter at Jason_OTC. Thank you for coming on the show, Jason.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. It was fun.
Thanks again, man.
Absolutely. We'll hear you next week.